I initially chose to cover Scion on the podcast for a couple of reasons. First, it had been a while since I got really excited about a book to cover. Gaiman's Eternals was a bit of a flop, in my opinion. Batman 3 Jokers was a super well-executed book, but I don't really love Batman, I just like Batman. And the Hellboy Omnibus was definitely not something that thrilled me. I appreciated experiencing that world, sure, but I didn't love it. I wanted to talk about Scion because this was a book that I loved during its lifetime. I have read a bunch of comics by Ron Marz since. I have stared at Jim Cheung's artwork for hours. This whole series is the comic book equivalent of being wrapped up in a blanket with a cup of hot cocoa for me. I just love it. Second, CrossGen was a big deal to me as a comic book fan. It debuted at the same time that I was discovering manga, anime, buying comics in trade paperback format at the bookstore, and earning money to do so by doing jobs and not just chores around the house. CrossGen was really the first time that I dove headfirst into another comic book company outside of Marvel as well, and I wanted to bring that to you folks. We've covered some Marvel, we've broken down some DC, we had some independents like Cliffhanger, Dark Horse, and Image slip into our breakdowns, but no CrossGen yet. I wanted to bring this world that I loved to you all, or at least present you with a sliver of it. Dip our collective toes into the pool that is CrossGen. Thirdly, and finally, one of the main reasons that I wanted to look at it again was to see if it still held up. Breakdowns are always an interesting experience for me, as I spend so much time reading these books and examining them that I generally come out of the experience in one of two ways. I either love a book more, like with Secret Six or Our Worlds at War, or I dislike the book more, like Gaiman's Eternals or Claremont's Fantastic Four Volume 3. There's a great bit of clarity and understanding that time can bring to one's experiences. I have changed as the years have gone on, and so my tastes in comics have changed too. Would my love for Scion remain as strong as it was back in 2004? Or would my modern, refined palate make reading through this comic a chore? I feared the answer, but I had to know. I love CrossGen too much to leave it in some kind of limbo space of uncertainty. I was either going to hate doing this breakdown, or I would come out of it with a renewed love for one of my favorite comics. So let's take one last look at the world of Avalon before we put these comics back in long boxes. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 18.25 of Scion, Sum and Substance. Perhaps the first thing that this breakdown challenged for me was my conception that Scion had some really good character work. And before you get outraged at me saying that, I will grant you that Scion does do some flooping great character work. With Ethan and with Braun. Everyone else is just kind of there. Very rarely in my comic buying experience have I felt like I saw a teenage character actually grow up in the course of a story. I've seen Peter Parker go from an awkward teen to a confident hero in general, but by the time that I started buying Spider-Man comics, Pete was already an adult, married to Mary Jane, and expecting a potential child at the time. Even getting to read alternate reality stories like Ultimate Spider-Man don't really feel like Peter grows up in the story. Peter in issue 1 feels very much like Peter in issue 100. Is there more complexity to his character? Sure, but do I feel like he grew up? Do I feel like he matured? Not at all. I can even look to manga for another good example of this in Goku. The Goku that we see in Dragon Ball Z, or Super, or even the back half of Dragon Ball, to be honest, feels exactly the same as the young Goku that we saw at the beginning of Dragon Ball. He's dumb, he loves his friends, and he likes a challenge. This sense of timelessness can be great in a story, as it allows the characters to be applied to just about any time period. Spider-Man originally debuted in 1962, 80 years ago, but he can be just as fresh and modern as any other character who debuted in the past 10 years. But this is also where the timelessness can become a fault of the character, because while Peter can grow and change, he is limited in the scope of those changes. You can't change Peter Parker too much, because then he loses that sense of timelessness. He becomes one story instead of being able to become any story. This wasn't something that CrossGen was worried about. They were focused on making sure that their stories felt timeless. Stories about good overcoming evil, about people overcoming the challenges that they face, and people who are gifted with power choosing to help others with it. These are stories that echo back throughout humanity's history. They are the foundations for heroic fiction. This allows CrossGen's characters to undergo actual growth in the course of their narrative. Ethan starts off Scion wanting nothing more than glory. He dreams of winning the tournament, literally, of being loved by everyone. But by the time we reach the end of Scion, Ethan dreams of protecting his family, of creating a home for the lesser races. He dreams of helping people and earning their love through service. We literally get to watch Ethan mature as he loses the people who are close to him, as his preconceived notions about others are challenged, and we get to see him make mistakes. When Ethan met Exeter, he thought that he was with the Underground. Wrong. When Ethan met Ashley, he figured that she must have hated the Raven royal family for their treatment of their lesser races, and wrong. When he encountered Exeter again, Ethan thought that he slaughtered the Underground. Wrong. How often do we get to see our leading character screw up in heroic fiction and not just come back from it in an issue or two? Or how often do we get to see them make that same kind of mistake again and again, demonstrating that their inbuilt biases are not that easy to shake? And then to still have them overcome them over time, even after that failure? I certainly can't remember seeing that happen in the X-Men comics. As the book went on and Ethan grew up, Jim Cheung's rendering of him changed as well. Ethan feels more muscular, but not in a showy, bulked-up superhero kind of way. He starts this book vaguely in shape, I'll give you that, but he has more of like a kid's rounded, doughy body. He is very much a prince. As he adventures and travels and goes hungry while he's on the road and fights more, he slowly sharpens up. His round cheeks turn into a square jaw, his big eyes thin into more of an adult shape. Visually, it even feels like Ethan grows, matching our emotional change, and that is super satisfying. The only other character who has some great characterization in this comic is Brawn. And I mean, how fitting is that? You need a great villain to pair off with a great hero, and floop doop if Brawn is not a great villain. He's egotistical, he's proud, he's oblivious to the feelings of others, he has the perfect mix of like an inferiority complex paired with narcissism. Watching almost any scene with Brawn was always a treat, but not because he's a great guy or because I want to be like Brawn. It was specifically because he is a terrible person. If Brawn threatened to kill someone, we had to take that threat seriously because he killed his own father. If Brawn would kill him, then who wouldn't he kill? Especially as we got towards the end of Scion, when Brawn returned to take the throne back from court. Those scenes with the two brothers felt so loaded with subtext and hidden threats. There was just so much story meat on those bones that I loved it. Watching Brawn gain more and more power as the series went on, but still ultimately failing to defeat Ethan, was so tasty as well. I can completely sympathize with reaching for a goal that seems like it'll never be yours, and so I can understand Brawn's frustration. As a dark mirror for Ethan, I think that Brawn is perfectly executed. So fascinating. Unfortunately, the rest of the cast suffers from a lack of attention. Despite Skink's closeness to Ethan and the depth of his history with him, Skink reads as quiet, forgettable, and detached. He is said to have raised Ethan, and yet when Ethan is in danger or is about to do something stupid, rarely does Skink act or seem emotional at all. Perhaps the only time that Skink really feels like someone with an emotional history with Ethan is when he is teasing him about maybe having feelings for Ashley. That's the only time that I was like, oh yeah, I could see this guy having raised this kid, sure. Complicating the sense of frustration is Skink's origin and backstory, which Scion doesn't explore at all. Mars hinted at Skink's otherworldly origin throughout the run, like when he put Ethan to sleep in the dungeon, when he survived the Northern Storm on his own, when he projected a ghost of Artor. That's a thing! Clearly something is going on with Skink, but we are never given an answer or an explanation for it. This bit of storytelling is absolutely tied into the broader picture of the CrossGen universe. If we had been reading more than one of their titles, then you might know more about Skink and where he comes from. One of CrossGen's main selling points was that you could read one of their books and have a complete and total experience. Or you could read multiple books and understand more of the broader picture. As someone who bought everything when it was originally coming out, this breakdown of just Scion was a super fascinating experience. I have never experienced the story this way, and so during this read-through, I definitely now think that CrossGen failed on their promise, at least to some degree. If I had only been reading Scion then, like we just did, then I am left with mysteries that weren't solved or explained, nor was any direction given to me as to where to look for answers. That is a pretty big failing in a story. And I have gone back and forth on whether or not I wanted to give you folks those answers here. After all, I provided some context to the appearances of the first, Mai Shen and Burned Rex, so I mean, why not Skink? I don't plan to cover another CrossGen comic for quite some time, and I don't really want to leave you hanging. So, let's see how much of this I can remember off the top of my head. Skink is an avatar of another character from CrossGen named Danik. Danik is a cast member of the comic book Crux. He is enigmatic, powerful, and quiet, and he is hugely important to the CrossGen universe. You see, Danik is an Atlantean, and yes, if that's a phrase you didn't think you were going to hear, I do mean he is from Atlantis. Millions of years ago, the inhabitants of Atlantis felt that they had reached the peak of their spiritual development. Each citizen was gifted with their own superpower, a power born from their mind and shaped by their personality. A group of Atlanteans, led by Danik, believed that by unifying their minds and bodies into one, they could evolve into their next state of being. A large portion of Atlantis' population disagreed with this and wanted to stay behind in the physical world to shepherd the up-and-coming race of humanity to the same level of spiritual enlightenment. They had themselves put into stasis in order to sleep through whatever changes this transition wrought. The rest of the Atlanteans gathered together and evolved into beings of energy and power. Another Atlantean who underwent this transition was named Solasandra, a proud, brash, and fiery young woman. Solasandra used her newfound powers to play with a portion of the galaxy, creating the race of gods known as the First. Solasandra and the First then went on to create more worlds and peoples, which are the various worlds that populate the CrossGen universe. Fast forward a few thousand years, and we reach the beginning of CrossGen's comics, where we saw a pair of glowing orange eyes discussing the state of the universe. One of those pair was the creator, Solasandra, and the other one was called the Mentor, who was actually Danik. Danik coached Solasandra into creating the Sigil Bearers, and he then split himself into dozens of other beings who watched over and guided the development of the Sigil Bearers. These beings were all noted for their glowing orange eyes and inexplicable powers. Reality itself was rewritten to include them in the histories of our various comic book characters. So despite Skink not actually existing until Ethan was chosen to get the sigil, he was retroactively placed in Avalon's history. Every so often, the mentors would merge back together into Danik, allowing him to collate their varied experiences and maybe adjust the way that he was dealing with everybody. But why, Ben? Wow, that's pretty kind of convoluted, right? Why would Danik manipulate Solasandra like that? Why spy on the sigil bearers? Why guide them? To what end was all of this being done? Well, in his own travels, Danik learned of another universe, ruled by a military empire called the Negation. After eons of peace and ease, Danik didn't think that the First would be able to react to this threat fast enough to do any good. The CrossGen universe needed defenders. It needed warriors. It needed heroes who had overcome great challenges. So he manipulated Solasandra into giving out the sigil, and then used his mentor avatars to challenge and push the sigil bearers. This would prepare the bearers for the inevitable, for the war against the Negation. Obviously, a lot of that backstory never came into play for Scion, which is exactly why Mars never mentioned it. There is no easy way to explain Skink's origin in a context that Ethan would appreciate or that would enhance our enjoyment of Scion. In fact, I would actually argue that other CrossGen titles that do explain this back matter, or hint at it at the very least, do it in a very intrusive way that doesn't really add to the story of that particular book. Scion, in my opinion, is stronger for not having mentioned a lot of this stuff. So now that I've told you all of that, dear listener, I have to ask, would you still be interested in learning more about CrossGen titles? Did everything that I just tell you excite you, or did it intimidate you? To this day, I am still amazed at how some comic universes utilize this level of interconnectivity and still excite me. The Marvel Universe, the CrossGen Universe, I love this stuff. I learn about a new connection somewhere, and I'm off to buy another 15 issues of a book that I have never heard of. But then we have other companies where that level of storytelling just seems to frustrate me, like the DC Universe or the Wildstorm Universe. Obviously, at a certain point, this buying habit just comes down to the personal taste of the shopper. Man, CrossGen was singing across my taste buds like a delicious bacon and egg sandwich. But none of that means that Skink was well written or that he had a particularly interesting character arc. He doesn't. And his only plot point, being mysterious, is never explained or breached at all. In fact, about the third of the way through Scion, the book just kind of gives up on doing anything with Skink, and he just fades into the background. I kind of wish Mars could have just somehow retired him and we wouldn't have had to worry about it. Exeter at least has a character arc, going from a remorseless hunter of his own kind to a warrior for their freedom. I super dig Exeter's arc and his interactions with Ethan. Being spared by Ethan caused Exeter to question what his life was worth, and he found the answer disappointing. So he changed. That's great, and I love it. But Mars does little else with Exeter. He basically just becomes a mouthpiece for the underground, or a big pile of muscle for the rest of the run. He doesn't question anything, he doesn't aspire to do anything more with himself. We don't even get to see him befriend Skink or Ashley. Exeter is just accepted and present for the rest of the book. We almost have an interesting plotline when he kills the assassin who tried to kill Ethan on the Sanctuary Isle, but that tidbit is never revealed to Ethan, and so that story doesn't go anywhere. I love Exeter's loyalty to Ethan, though. He was willing to die for the Underground's cause multiple times, and I would have loved to have seen that bit of psychology explored more. Was Exeter willing to die because he knew that it was the right thing defending innocent people? Or was Exeter willing to die as a form of punishment for having hurt his own people for so long? I don't know, and I would love to have seen that explored, but we didn't. Ashley is a character who has a profound impact on Ethan and this book's overall direction. Without Ashley, it's possible that Ethan never joins the Underground or fights for their cause. If they hadn't been forced together after Ethan's attempt to kill Braun, it's possible that he would have just gone home and been a Heron Prince for the rest of his life. That said, Ashley gets a lot of subtle story examination, but she doesn't really get much of an arc. She does have an arc, don't get me wrong, starting out the series as paranoid and distrustful of Ethan, unwilling to really count on anyone outside of her underground allies. By working with Ethan, who, remember, to her, was from the enemy house, Ashley found a kindred spirit and ultimately someone that she could count on. I loved when Mars played with her strained relationship with her family, or even the strong relationship that she had with her father before his demise. Along those same lines, when Ashley met Elena for the first time and they kind of bonded as sisters, I thought that was great. Mars did make some late-game attempts to reestablish Ashley as a physically brave and capable fighter during Year 3, as well as someone who is willing to take risks in the name of doing good. Ashley is heroic. But as Scion approached its end, I do feel that a lot of those ideas fell away, so that the narrative could focus more strongly on Ethan. It is frustrating to see her basically sidelined after having such an impact on Ethan, especially when so little is done with the rest of the cast. And I know that Ethan is our lead character, but so much of this book has focused on other Scions, other children, Braun, Ashley, Exeter, Kai, and Elena. Why couldn't Ashley get that same level of treatment and respect that Ethan got? And I know it's because she's paired with Ethan, and Ethan's our lead character, but he doesn't have to be our lead character in everything. The rest of our cast is wide and pretty varied. We got Court, Mai Shen, King Dane, Queen Mariella, Kai, Elena, Elijah, Nadia, the Khanate, the Raven King for a while there, Victor. All of these characters play their parts well for the most part. Kai is an unlikable ass for almost a year, but it does come from concerns that his character would have. So while they are frustrating behaviors, I don't think that they're bad story elements. Elena is pretty awesome throughout pretty much her whole existence once she actually develops a bit of a personality, and Mariella gets that totally no swearing moment to shine right before she dies, unfortunately. Ethan's relationship with Dane is actually really interesting, but that's largely thanks to the monkey wrench that Mai Shen throws into it when she impersonates him. Dane's amnesic story element, which could have been really interesting, gets kind of abandoned once Tigress attacks, so it lacks any kind of real oomph, and even the stakes that Eddington manufactures in setting Dane up in that position don't really go anywhere. Nadia is perhaps the biggest dropped character ball for me. Ethan is our lead character, Ashley is the love interest, Skink is the best friend, and Exeter is the muscle. This book needs a brain. And who would have been a better brain than a science-based robot warrior? I would have loved to have seen the Nadia unit that palled around with Ethan actually come to care and respect for the individuality of our heroes, and see her break away from her own government. After all, without the gift of free will, Ashley would never have rebelled from her family to aid the underground. Ethan would never have left his family in the middle of a war to join the underground. And Exeter would never have made the decision to change his life. The Sanctuary Isle itself, lauded by the Tigressians as a step in the right direction for relationships with the lesser races, would not have existed if our cast had been slaves to the nations that birthed them. Having Nadia learn that from our cast would have been great and made her stand out amongst the rest of them. We see a lot of anti-AI sentiment towards the Tigressian forces in our final arc, and that makes sense. They're the aggressors. Human beings always villainize their enemies in combat situations, but you would think that the lesser races would maybe have some sympathy for a race that was created by humanity in order to be their slaves, only to rise up and seek dominion. But Ethan, Ashley, Exeter, all of the Sanctuary Isle, and especially the Janissaries after they show up, they are all really bloodthirsty in facing the Tigressians. Rather than acknowledging the AI as a sentient race of their own, they're just evil robots. And I feel like Scion has never worked with such black and white concepts before this story. Mars' Scion showed us the bad sides of the Ravens and the Herons, telling us that neither side is purely good or purely evil. I would like to have seen that level of sophistication applied to our finale. We do have some hope for the future, though. Eddington's vision of the future promises a second and third Automata war, so it's not like Tigris is out of the game yet. But Mars's vision shows Nadia standing with our cast. So in my heart, I believe that Nadia's experiences did change her. It might just take some time for those changes to work their way through all of the social and literal programming of her homeland. This sudden final 4-issue shift in our narrative from Mars to Eddington is perhaps the biggest fail in Scion's overall use of its themes. Obviously, a big part of Scion is its commentary on racism. Ethan and Ashley fight for the freedom of the lesser races, who are a group of living, sentient beings. This is the right thing to do, and it should be obvious to most people. But Scion adds a secondary wrinkle to this story by making the lesser races genetically created. These are beings that were made to work. That was their intention. That was the function. That's why their slavery is so accepted and prevalent throughout the world. Even in the real world, there are still people who look at others as less than human. And the lesser races aren't even human. They are something completely different, and it makes it harder for the people of Avalon to sympathize with their plight. But, as we're shown, the lesser races are intelligent, thinking beings. Maybe they don't look human, and maybe they were made for a purpose, but their ability to self-determine grants them the right to freedom. They should be able to decide for themselves what they want to be, where they want to be, who they want to befriend or work for or love. This particular narrative drives Scion's forward momentum, lasting about up to the foundation of the Sanctuary Isle. I do feel that Mars and Eddington drop the ball in really engaging with the lesser races, though. We have a few examples in our main cast, Exeter and Skink, but as I just covered, they don't really have their own ongoing stories. They themselves aren't people, they aren't characters, they are tools who are used to supplement Ethan's story. We don't get to see any notable lesser race characters fight for independence or carve out their own life or add anything to their own struggle. I complained before when Ethan was made the leader of the Sanctuary Isle that I thought this was a pretty lame move. I would rather have seen Ethan build a council of lesser races leaders, show them how to lead, give them those kind of opportunities. But I am also someone who grew up in a democracy, which is, at least in its idealized form, governed by the choices of those being governed. The lesser races have all lived in a world governed by kings and queens, of those ruling either by divine will or thanks to the weight of history. The Heron royal family has always ruled, as far as we know, and so they continue to rule on the Sanctuary Isle, just with Ethan as their figurehead. Following Ethan is natural in their world, however much it bothers me. And it bothers me a lot. I also have a slight complaint about the Janissaries here, and a semi-interesting story suggestion. Korak, the de facto leader of the Janissaries, is the closest that we get to having another lesser races character. He is barely a character, but he's here, so he counts, but I don't think that we need him. I think that it would have been much more interesting if Ethan had learned about Exeter's execution of the assassin, and so he banishes Exeter from the island. Exeter would then go on to become a freedom fighter back in the Ravenlands, hooking up with the Janissaries and earning a place as their leader. When Ethan and his siblings encounter them in the woods, they would actually meet Exeter there, and Ethan would apologize for banishing him and offer him a place on the Sanctuary Isle once again. Exeter would take the compass and think about it, and then show up in the final hour like Korak did. This could explore Exeter's feelings about Ethan as an ally, since they disagree on the methods used to achieve equality, Exeter being much more violent and Ethan being much more diplomatic. This could also explore Exeter's sense of self-hatred, and if that has healed at all now that he is aiding and helping the lesser races instead of hunting them. Maybe Exeter even begins to lead from a place of fear initially, like a tyrant, and his encounter with Ethan is what reminds him to show compassion and to earn respect. You could even have further story parallels run between Exeter and Ethan by having Exeter be the one who suggests that the various Janissaries tribes unite into one fighting force, like Ethan trying to unite the lesser races on the Sanctuary Isle. This would be much more interesting to me than just having Exeter babysit the island all the time, and it would even allow Skink to be the de facto head of state for the Isle. After all, if Ethan is a decent human being and diplomat, which he is, then a lot of that credit has to go to Skink for raising him. Why not allow Skink to demonstrate those skills as the head of the island, at least when Ethan and Ashley are away? That allows Exeter and Skink to be much more their own characters and place them in super important roles within the world of Avalon, while still allowing us to focus on Ethan and Ashley's experiences. That said, here's the problem that I have with the Janissaries. When we first met them back in Scion issue 15, they are presented to us as a single rogue fighting unit. That they were made for war, but they were too dangerous, and so they were able to break loose, and now they just roam the countryside. But Korak's reintroduction suggests that over 3,000 of these beings were made. You're telling me that it took the Raven Nation 3,000 tries to make a ferocious warrior and they didn't kill the failures? They just kept crapping out war monkeys? That seems ridiculous, and I kind of hate that idea.
Sir, they are clearly too dangerous and strong for us to hold.
I understand. Guess we'll have to make 2,992 more of them just to be sure that we can't control them, but we'll make no changes to the method or do anything that would allow us to control them directly.
Oh, yes, sir.
It's just dumb. If they were that powerful and that numerous, then why weren't they a bigger problem for the Raven Nation? You're telling me that over 3,000 bandits were running around pillaging and killing people, and no one has mentioned it in all this time? This just feels like a very ill-thought-out idea. And they're monkeys. And again, I don't like monkeys, and I don't like how cheap of a design element this feels like. Rather than design a new race, or even, again, have them be inspired by Exeter's general design, since he's clearly such a skilled and established warrior, why wouldn't you just make more of him? And then you could put Exeter in charge of the... it's so easy. It just made... So the concept of freedom, or self-determination, is well demonstrated within this comic by Ethan and Ashley's own narratives, as I've said before. They chose to go against the wishes and traditions of their own families, to be unique individuals in a world built on honor and duty. Duty to your nation, duty to your family, duty to the history that came before you. These are basic ideas that people still struggle with, even now. We don't want to let down those around us, our family, our friends, our coworkers. And we saw the struggles that Ashley had with her family, and that Ethan had as well. Taking a new route is not always easy, but it can be the right thing to do. And sometimes it can even be the necessary thing to do. This is backed up by that oldest of comic book concepts, that with great power must come great responsibility. This is most readily demonstrated by Ethan, who is handed the sigil at the start of the comic and struggles with the responsibilities that it brings for about the first 2 years. The sigil accidentally scars Braun, and Ethan takes responsibility for it. Ashley broke him out of the dungeons. He was willing to take responsibility for it and return. When he learned about the Ravens' impending invasion, he risked life and limb to return home and warm his family. These are things that Ethan didn't have to do. He could have just told Braun no. He would not surrender in issue 2. The Ravens and Herons would have gone to war and justified it the entire time. And I mean, the Ravens were looking for an excuse anyways. But Ethan could have said no. But he didn't. Because Ethan knew that saying no would have been the wrong thing to do. That would have meant spending innocent lives in a war that had no good reason behind it. Ethan would rather suffer personally than have others do it for him. This is where his true nobility lies, and I love that aspect of him. And I love that this comic forces us to choose between two really, really justifiable rights. Helping your family or helping the people around you. Choosing one over the other, neither one of those is wrong. You just have to do what is right for you as an individual and as a person. This theme is also demonstrated by Ashley, who gave up her title and position in the Ravenlands to help the lesser races. Again, she didn't have to do that, but her position granted her great power, and taking care of all of her people, including the lesser races, was part of her responsibilities, even if the rest of her family didn't agree. Exeter had great physical strength, but he was wasting it by capturing his own people and selling them back into slavery. Even Skink, whose responsibilities lie beyond the single world of Avalon, constantly has to push Ethan into dangerous situations in order to hone him in the name of the greater conflict with the negation. But Skink also watched Ethan grow up. There has to be some amount of love there, and so there has to be some amount of pain. That's something that I wish that Mars had explored more, but alas, it's too late now. The horrors of war and its cost is another idea that is well represented in Scion. From the jump, Mars has the Heron forces be willing to fight for Ethan's freedom, but when he is willing to give himself up, well, then they're willing to pay that cost. Again, better that one person suffer than a whole nation. It is incredibly easy for us to sympathize with the Herons here, and Mars makes us dislike the Ravens by having them prep for war anyways, and the royal family kinda just be jerks in general. But when Ethan returned home with news about the invasion, the Herons were already in their war room. They were ready to go when the word came down for war. So while they had wished to avoid war, perhaps war was never too far from their own thoughts. And we certainly saw Kai threaten a number of throats in this comic book, and that is not something that healthy, happy people do outside of wartime. Neither side of our nations are made out to be saints. They have gone to war before, they will go to war again, either in the name of adding territory to their kingdoms and glory to their history, or they'll do so in order to defend themselves from the other side. Mars doesn't really vilify either goal, but he doesn't shy away from showing us the costs of war either. The Herons bravely defend themselves, but Artor dies. Ethan attempts to assassinate Braun, clearly a good thing to do when Braun is as bloodthirsty as he is, but he nearly dies in the process. The Herons then land on Raven soil, taking the fight back to the aggressors, but then they're slaughtered at Felgard Notch. War is bad in that it costs lives, but humans can go to war for good reasons. When Tigris invades, it is with the goal of enslaving everyone. The nations had to defend themselves against them, and Eddington even has Ethan doubt the morality of this act. Maybe if they surrendered, those lives spent would still be here, alive, and able to find at least some kind of happiness. But our cast, and our story in general, reminds us that no. Scion is about coexistence and equality, and that cannot be found under the heel of a boot. While Eddington does a pretty good job of continuing the themes and character arcs that Mars started, there is one thing about the final year of Scion that definitely bugs me, and that is the lack of the sigil. When Scion initially opened, the sigil was a front and center concern of Ethan and the book itself. This makes sense, as it was a brand new concept to the world, it was a huge selling point of CrossGen comics, and it had so drastically changed Ethan's life. The longer that the book went on, the more comfortable he got with it, and so the less important it became to our overall narrative. The same thing honestly happened with all of the CrossGen universe. The longer that CrossGen existed, the more complicated its worlds became, and people came to fear the sigil as a sign of that complication. Readers wanted to buy books that weren't superheroes, yes, and CrossGen's books were selling pretty well, but they also didn't want to have to commit to buying 6 or 7 books that maybe didn't feel all that connected, but were connected by that little red and yellow mark. CrossGen had seen a nice amount of success with titles like Sojourn, Ruse, Route 666, and El Cazador, all of which featured stories that were only tangentially connected to CrossGen's broader picture. The books featuring the sigil as a major plot point began to focus less on the sigil, on its origins or its abilities, the longer that they went on. I get that. I totally understand where they were coming from. But CrossGen sold itself on being connected but separate. And as someone who got into CrossGen because of its interconnectivity, it really bothers me to see that go away the longer the book goes on. Imagine reading a Spider-Man comic where after 2 years of publication, Spider-Man stops doing Spider-Man things. It just, I don't know. It just feels less interesting overall. Ethan might not question where the sigil came from anymore, but why not explore its powers more? Ethan's ability to separate the fleets could have come in super handy against, I don't know, the Tigresian fleet when it showed up on the island. And we saw that the sigil could heal Ethan, so could he heal other people? Or could he maybe generate more than a sword? We saw Ethan once make an energy dagger back in issue 12, so why not make a shield or armor? That would have been a really cool concept and a great visual to play with. His battles with Brawn seem to demonstrate a strength greater than normal and an ability to jump farther than normal, maybe even some light flying capabilities. Or maybe just some wuxia wire work. But these more subtle abilities seem to be ignored or forgotten most of the time when we're engaged in combat. Maybe CrossGen would have experimented more in the future, though. Issue 43 ends by mentioning that Ethan's journey will continue in the Negation War, which was the big story that CrossGen had been building to from the start. The Negation Empire had found a way to infiltrate the CrossGen universe, what the story referred to as the Bright Universe to the Negation's Dark Universe. Some of those forces were seen in other CrossGen titles, hints of what was to come and the kinds of enemies that our heroes would face. The various sigil bearers of the CrossGen universe were to be gathered into an army, and they would help fight back. If I remember correctly, every individual title was going to be cancelled, while a mini-series called The Negation War would show us what happened during the conflict. And then the CrossGen universe would relaunch with new stories, heroes, and places of focus. It was easily the largest and most ambitious line change that I had heard of since Marvel canceled the X-Men books in order to do the Age of Apocalypse back in the 90s. And it would stay that way until DC canceled its entire publishing line to do the New 52 relaunch back in 2011. So maybe Ethan would expand his skills when he met the other sigil bearers. One of the neat things about the sigil is that its manifestations are based upon their users, so every character did different things with it. So Ethan could meet Sephi from Meridian and learn how to heal other people or how to fly, or maybe he would meet Sam from the comic Sigil and learn how to manipulate matter. Once those characters started comparing notes on what their sigil was and how it worked, who knows what they could learn before they walked away from that conflict. The potential there is amazing. Assuming, of course, that they would survive the conflict. While we didn't get to see it too much here, CrossGen was willing to kill some of its characters, a fact demonstrated in the book called Negation, whose writer, Tony Bedard, would be writing the Negation War. It is possible that Ethan would never return to Avalon after his role in the war, maybe trapped on the other side of the galaxy with a small squad of surviving sigil bearers. Maybe he would die, and Avalon would be left unprotected during this invasion. He could be captured by the enemy and trapped in a whole nother universe, like who knows what could happen. I mean, sure, Mars and Eddington promised us visions of the future, but in the world of comic books, no future is written in stone. Publishing demands beat out sugar-coated promises any day of the week, so who knows what could have happened. You would think something like a cross-universal war with aliens would get mentioned during that history lesson we saw at the end of issue 43, but we saw nothing like that in our visions of the future. So who knows if that plan was even taken into account. That said, I do think that the ending that Eddington gave us wasn't a terrible one. It is oddly distant for my tastes. I would rather that we had stayed focused on Ethan and had a much more personal ending. But we know that he survived, we know that he had a kid, and we know that he went on to live for quite some time. Without the interruption of the Negation War, Ethan seems to have lived a full and happy life, and we saw many of our ongoing stories wrapped up nicely by the end of Scion. Brawn was defeated and remains imprisoned, as far as we know. Tigris was beaten back, at least for now, and the peace between the Heron and Raven nations seems assured, with King Court on the Raven throne and Dane returning to himself. The Sanctuary Isle seems to have solved its various problems as well, now adding an army to its assets with the addition of the Janissaries. I didn't mention this when Ian Eddington first came on board the book, but I was kind of worried to see his name. Eddington is an author that I know best as a follow-up writer. He took over X-Force from Warren Ellis after Ellis revamped the book back in 2000, and I was not a big fan of that time period. Continuing my preconceived notion, Eddington would also take over writing CrossGen Sojourn from Ron Mars with issue 25, and he would also help him co-write Witchblade, the ongoing series that Mars took over upon leaving CrossGen for several issues. Eddington does have a pretty impressive writing history, writing comics for franchises like Judge Dredd, The Terminator, The Aliens, Predator, Xena Warrior Princess, Planet of the Apes, some Batman comics for DC, The Establishment for Wildstorm, Blade for Marvel, and Warhammer 40k comics. He is clearly a skilled author, even if I found his final 2 issues to be the most different issues from the rest of Scion in the entire run. This is still a pretty seamless transition, I want to say, in my mind. A lot of times when a new author comes onto a book, they throw out everything that is old and just focus on making the book theirs. And I'm not saying that that is always a bad thing, but it's not what I would have wanted with Scion. And Eddington's first 2 issues really read like Mars issues really well. Overall, I think that Eddington has impressed me with his mostly seamless writing here. Other than Ethan shouting, "The die is cast!" twice in 2 issues, this is a pretty good read. Having reread the entire series now and finally broken it down, it is very clear to me that Scion is at its best up to issue 27. Part of me wants to say that this is because it's where we lose Jim Cheung as our full-time artist, but honestly, he still draws a number of issues from here on out, and issue 31, in which Brawn returned, is a standout highlight of the post-issue 27 run for me. But the narrative from issue 1 to 26 is such a steady build, with Ethan and Brawn's back-and-forth battles being dramatic and interesting. Watching that conflict build to their final fight on the Tournament Isle is a great arc, and Ethan's win there feels so definitive. As much as I love issue 31, I honestly love it because of the interactions between Brawn and Court, not its impact on our overall narrative. And quite frankly, after issue 27, Scion's focus is super scattered. Rather than focusing on our newly established status quo, meaning the defense and development of the Sanctuary Isle, Mars chooses to send Ethan off to the Heronlands, and then to Tigris, and then to the Ravenlands again, just bouncing from one problem to the next. It feels less like an arc, and more like something put together from a random plot generator. And while Eddington does a pretty good job of bringing Tigris to the war table, his 4 issues honestly do feel a bit tacked on to me. I honestly could live with issue 39 just being the final issue of Scion, and the war with Tigris going untold. I'm sure that if that was where Scion had ended, then I would be singing a different tune, and wishing that we at least seen the war with Tigris. Come on, guys, even if it was just 4 issues. So I don't think there's any way I was going to be happy about seeing Scion end, but this was a pretty good way. Ultimately, I liked what we got, and I am happy that Scion got to wrap up its most pressing plot lines, at least. Not a lot of comic books get to do that, especially when the company that is publishing them is going bankrupt. So in the end, is Scion still a personal favorite of mine? Absolutely. Mars's writing is simple yet full of depth, and he creates some excellent characters in Ethan and Brawn. That quality does not last for the whole book, unfortunately, but I still don't hate the rest of it. Unlike Claremont's Fantastic Four, which I enjoyed reading on my first pass-through, but then kinda came to really dislike as I broke it down, Scion's positives still outweigh its negatives for me. I wonder how other CrossGen titles hold up. Out of CrossGen's entire line, my top 5 would probably be... they'd probably be Scion, Meridian, Negation, Route 666, and I think The Path. Maybe the first somewhere in there too, although that's a top 6, not a top 5. And don't worry, dear listener, I'm not diving into another CrossGen book so quickly. I would kind of love to. I could probably do a whole secondary podcast where I just talk about CrossGen's books and their interconnectivity, but I don't have that kind of time. And as much as I love CrossGen, I am ready for a break. I want to mix things up a bit. I want some variety in our next few episodes. Like, this focus on Scion has been great, but I am ready to be somewhere else. So this time I picked a theme, and that theme is going to run me through a number of different comic books. CrossGen published comics from every genre save romance and westerns, and the fans' demand for westerns always puzzled me. Why did people want a western? What's the draw there? So I decided to find out. Next week is going to be a skip week. Don't worry, there'll still be an episode, but it's going to be a break episode where I just kind of chat with y'all about what's been going on. I have been working very hard to produce the next set of episodes, and I have been feeling burned out and tired like I haven't since I was running the overnight trucks for my paying job. So, join me next week for a nice, simple chat, and then take another week to saddle up, partner. Make sure your guns are loaded, brush down your horse, and check your saddle straps. We're going to start exploring Marvel's Wild West books with a bit of a history lesson. Join me in 2 weeks for Comic Book Breakdown episode 19.1, partner. The Legends of Marvel's Wild West. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.